Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our channel, Pakistan Zindabad, the next world superpower. This is episode 39, and today we're launching into a truly massive and crucial topic. It's an exploration that many of you, our listeners, have actually requested, and it forces us to confront some of the deepest structural issues facing modern nations.
It really does. We're talking about constitutional philosophy, about the hard framework of good governance.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're drawing extensively from a landmark work.
A really powerful book, Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan, written by Mr. Zaheer Ahmad Meer.
And this text, it's important to say, it doesn't just chronicle historical facts.
No, not at all. It delivers a severe, almost surgical analysis of state failure.
Right.
But it also provides a profound blueprint for an accountable, stable state.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is, well, it's pretty laser-focused.
Right.
We're going to extract the author's precise analysis of how unchecked authority inevitably leads to national destruction.
And, more importantly, how Muhammad Ali Jinnah's original vision provides the exact antidote for that kind of decay.
It's a deep, deep dive into the architecture of systemic failure and, hopefully,
Systemic repair.
systemic repair. I like that. So where do we even begin with something this big?
We have to start with the center of gravity of the entire source material. It's a blunt, unavoidable constitutional warning.
Okay.
The book states it very clearly. A state collapses not because laws are absent, but because law is not applied equally.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
let's just pause on that for a second. That is a stark and, frankly, a terrifying differentiation.
It is.
It's not the lack of statutes on the books. It's not that the nation hasn't, codified what's right and wrong.
Precisely. It's the failure of application, the failure of the system to enforce those rules universally for everyone without exception.
And that failure of universal application, that defines the crisis we're talking about today.
It does. It defines the crisis this deep dive must confront, the culture of impunity.
Impunity, that's the key word here.
Yeah, it's everything. And this isn't just about, individual corruption or a few bad actors stealing funds. That's just a symptom.
So what's the disease?
The author argues that it's a systemic, structural belief that certain powerful elites, certain institutional groups are fundamentally above the legal limits that bind the average citizen.
So it moves beyond being a simple crime problem.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes a constitutional crisis.
A crisis of legitimacy.
Exactly. The structural impunity is the disease. And the core argument the book lays out is that governance without accountability destroys nations from within. It's like a cancer.
So if the highest office holders, the wealthiest individuals, the most connected families, if they all operate with this kind of invisible legal shield,
then you cannot, by definition, maintain a stable, functioning nation. The law becomes theater. It becomes a suggestion for the powerful and a crushing, unavoidable reality for the weak.
So if we accept that the rule of law is the foundation of the state,
Which it is.
then accountability is the essential structural integrity. It's what prevents the entire building from collapsing.
A perfect analogy.
Okay, so let's look at how the Quaid, Jinnah, conceptualized that structural integrity. Let's start with his ideal vision for what a state office should even be.
This is exactly where we must begin, because the pathology of impunity, it starts when the fundamental concept of power is misunderstood or deliberately twisted.
And Jinnah's starting point.
His philosophical starting point was a categorical rejection of power as a personal privilege, an absolute rejection.
And that idea itself, that rejection, is the intellectual, moral, and legal antithesis of impunity.
Precisely. He didn't just reject the idea of power as a spoil system, something you win and get to distribute to your friends.
He went further.
He proactively structured the entire concept of holding state office around a moral and legal duty. The book details 4 core tenets of governance, as envisioned by the Quaid-e-Azam, and they're worth dwelling on. They define the accountable state.
Okay, walk us through those 4 tenets.
They sound deceptively simple, but they're utterly transformative if you actually enforce them.
Right.
First, authority is a trust. Second, power is not privilege. Third, office is responsibility. And fourth, governance is service.
That is a powerful quartet of concepts.
Yeah.
So let's spend a moment on that first one. Authority is a trust. What does that specifically mean in constitutional terms. Sounds like a nice motto, but what's the legal weight?
It has immense legal weight. If you view authority as a trust, you legally and morally establish that the office holder is not the owner of the power they wield.
They're just a custodian.
A temporary custodian, exactly. They're operating on behalf of a beneficiary, the people of the state.
Which means every single decision.
Every decision, every expenditure, every use of force must be justified by the best interest of that beneficiary.
And if it's not?
Then the custodian is inherently accountable for their stewardship. Any failure, any misuse is a breach of trust. And that should carry very, very high consequences.
That reframing is radical because it elevates the misuse of authority from, say, a simple administrative error or a misdemeanor
Into a profound act of betrayal.
Yes. If you're entrusted with public funds and you misuse them, you haven't just committed a financial crime.
You've broken the moral contract of the state itself.
Wow.
And the second, third points just reinforce this. Power is not privilege, and office is responsibility. The moment an office holder assumes power, they are taking on a burden of duty.
Not collecting entitlements.
Not at all. They're taking responsibility for outcomes. This way of thinking, it fundamentally prevents the emergence of an untouchable elite class, which is, the very thing the culture of impunity feeds on.
It seems like Jinnah was looking far into the future, almost seeing the dangers of the very personalized power structures that eventually did emerge.
I think he was.
In defining what the state should be, the book says he was just as clear on what it should not be.
Absolutely. He specifically rejected unchecked authority, personal rule, favoritism, and the structural creation of elite immunity. He understood that these are the levers by which a democracy can revert back to an aristocracy or, even a monarchy in practice.
Because if the leader can rule by whim, and his associates are protected just because of their association,
the whole system of law collapses. It becomes meaningless.
So this wasn't just some abstract idealism about democracy. This was a highly pragmatic constitutional warning against the exact path the nation eventually took.
It was absolutely pragmatic. He was warning against the path of allowing certain classes of people to rise above the foundational legal structure.
A structure that's supposed to bind everyone equally.
It has to. Jinnah envisioned a state where every office holder, from the lowest clerk processing a land deed to the most powerful military or civilian leader, was strictly accountable to the established law and procedures.
And if that mechanism of accountability fails?
The system fails. It doesn't matter how many wonderful laws are written or how eloquent the Constitution is.
So we have to return to that constitutional warning that the author identifies as the starting point of systemic decay.
We do. Power without accountability is the first step toward tyranny.
And the author emphasizes that this tyranny, it doesn't have to be violent or, overtly dictatorial with tanks in the streets.
No, it can be a quiet, corrosive tyranny. The tyranny of the elite over the common citizen.
The tyranny of having your money, your influence, or your connections determine whether or not you face justice.
And that brings us directly to the pathology of how that silent tyranny takes hold. We need to shift our focus now, moving into the structural causes, the how of this systemic decay.
Right. It's easy to focus on individual bad apples, a corrupt minister here, a crooked official there.
But the book forces us to see this as a systemic failure. It's not an accident of history or just a string of bad luck. The system itself is structured to produce this outcome.
That structural perspective is so critical because when people talk about corruption, they often ask, why did that person steal? But the more crucial question, which the book addresses, is why did the system allow that person to steal without consequence? And why did it take so long for anyone to even find out?
That is the core idea right there. The structural failure is what enables impunity. And the idea that connects an individual action to systemic rot is this. When wrongdoing goes unpunished, corruption becomes culture.
That transformation from an individual act, a mistake, a deviation to a cultural norm, is just profoundly damaging.
It's devastating.
Because once it's culture, it's just how things work.
Yeah.
People stop seeing it as corruption and start seeing it as, well, a mandatory cost of doing business or a necessary evil for getting anything done.
Exactly. And the source material meticulously details the 5 structural pillars that create and sustain this culture. These are the mechanisms of impunity. Understanding them is absolutely essential for any proposed reform.
Okay, let's analyze those mechanisms in detail, starting with the first and perhaps the most corrosive element the author identifies: selective accountability.
Selective accountability. This is the process through which the law is weaponized. It's not just inefficient or slow. It is a fundamental distortion of the very concept of law.
What does that look like in practice?
It means the law is applied rigorously, often with extreme prejudice, to the politically weak, the vulnerable, or the opposition.
But for the
For
powerful
the
bit.
powerful elite, the insiders, the well-connected, the institutional actors who are deemed essential or untouchable, that same legal framework is effectively suspended, delayed, or just ignored entirely.
So the state retains the full capacity to enforce the law,
Oh, absolutely. The capacity is there.
but it strategically chooses its targets based on political utility rather than any kind of judicial principle.
Precisely. This makes the entire legal system a tool of political control and survival. The law ceases to be a blind, impartial judge and becomes a political puppet master.
And that has to breed incredible cynicism among the populace.
It does, because they know implicitly that justice is for sale or for political alignment. They see it every day.
And that profound misuse of the law leads us directly into the second pillar: politicized institutions.
This is the natural, inevitable outcome of selective application. When your accountability tools, your anti-corruption bodies, your investigative agencies, the economic crime units, even sector-specific regulatory watchdogs, when they cease to serve the objective goal of justice,
They get hollowed out.
they're hollowed out completely. They become instruments used for political maneuvering, for vendettas, for silencing dissent.
So if an institution's primary mandate shifts from finding the truth to finding political leverage,
It loses its moral authority entirely. It just evaporates.
and the public sees that,
The author stresses that public perception here is key. If you, as a citizen, perceive that an anti-corruption body only targets those who oppose the current regime, whether that's a civilian or an institutional regime, its legitimacy is instantly lost.
so they stop being checks on power.
They become extensions of executive power or of the ruling elite, and this destruction of legitimacy is often more damaging than the corruption itself because it removes the public's ability to trust any part of the system.
And even when justice is technically pursued, when a case is actually filed against someone powerful, we run into the third deeply frustrating pillar: judicial delays.
This is a devastating point in the book. It frames delay not as some procedural glitch or an unfortunate backlog.
But as a deliberate structural protection.
Yes, justice delayed is silent injustice. The system is either designed or allowed to operate so slowly through endless, often frivolous adjournments, complex bureaucracy, and the chronic under-resourcing of the judiciary that even clear, evidence-backed cases of high-level wrongdoing get bogged down for years, sometimes decades.
And what's the practical consequence for the wrongdoer in that scenario?
Well, the wrongdoer, especially the one who is wealthy or politically connected, knows that even if they are caught, the final reckoning is so far off in the future that the threat of punishment loses all its deterrent effect.
So they can just keep operating.
They can continue to operate, continue to profit from their ill-gotten gains, and simply use the legal proceedings as a stalling mechanism. Impunity thrives in protracted legal processes because the cost of that delay is borne by the public, while the benefit accrues entirely to the accused. It's systematic protection built on the calendar.
That paints a very clear picture of the fourth pillar, who is the obvious beneficiary of all these failures: elite immunity.
This is where influence, privilege, and intricate networking entirely supersedes the rule of law. It creates a class of sacred cows who operate with the full confidence that they are above constitutional limits.
And who are these people?
They're defined by inherited wealth, political office, high military or bureaucratic rank, or some other institutional affiliation. They aren't just shielded from prosecution, they often operate in a parallel system of law entirely. Their connections ensure that investigations stall, evidence conveniently disappears, or charges are simply never filed in the first place.
It's a profound dual system problem. One set of laws for the powerful, and a completely different set for everyone else.
Exactly. And this dual reality is sustained by the fifth and final structural pillar: weak oversight mechanisms.
So if the police and the judiciary fail, the watchdogs should step in.
They should. But the book argues these watchdogs have been intentionally declawed and neutralized.
Which watchdogs are we talking about specifically here?
We're talking about institutions like the national audit institutions, which are supposed to track government spending and financial discipline, financial regulators who monitor the markets, internal departmental watchdogs.
And what's happened to them?
When these bodies are deliberately starved of resources, when their leadership is staffed by politically appointed cronies, or when their damning reports are routinely ignored and just gather dust on a shelf, misconduct can persist undetected and unchallenged for years.
So oversight, which is meant to be preventative, fails at its core mission.
It fails completely. And corruption becomes silently integrated into the standard operating procedure because there's no credible external threat of exposure or enforcement.
What we're left with, then, is a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle.
A terrible one. Selective accountability creates politicized institutions. Bureaucratic and judicial delays ensure elite immunity. And weakened oversight allows the entire structure to rot from within, undisturbed. It's a brilliant but very dark analysis of systemic decay.
And without accountability, the book asserts, governance is fundamentally fiction.
It's just a performance.
The budgets, the policies, the laws, they all become mere theater if there are no consequences for violating the script. That's a powerful and decisive assertion.
It is, because if you cannot rely on the state to hold its own agents accountable, then every single function of governance, from collecting taxes to delivering public services, is compromised. The entire foundation of legitimacy just dissolves.
So we have to ask the crucial so what question. If the stakes are this high, what does true functioning accountability actually deliver to a nation? Why is it the non-negotiable spine of a successful state?
It delivers everything that separates a functional state from a failing state. The book lists several crucial benefits, and they're all linked directly to predictability, efficiency, and most importantly, trust.
Okay, let's start with the internal benefits, the health of the system itself.
First and foremost, accountability ensures institutional discipline and the rule of law. Meaning, when every actor, regardless of their rank or position, knows the rules will be enforced swiftly and fairly, the system functions as it was designed to. It eliminates the element of whim and fosters predictable, rational behavior from public servants.
So you can rely on the institution, on the codified law, and the process.
Not on the temporary individual who just happens to be in charge today, and that stability is invaluable.
And that predictability is absolutely crucial for the economy, which I think leads to the next benefit, economic confidence and public trust.
This connection is so often overlooked. Accountability isn't just some moral imperative, it's sound economic policy.
How so?
Transparency and the rigorous enforcement of contracts and anti-corruption laws are absolute prerequisites for attracting and retaining both domestic and foreign investment. I mean, think about it.
Right.
Why would a multinational investor or even a local entrepreneur trying to grow their business put substantial capital into a system where contracts can be arbitrarily canceled, where permits require massive, undocumented bribes, or where their politically connected competitors operate by entirely different legal rules?
They wouldn't. The lack of accountability acts as a massive risk premium on the entire economy.
Exactly. Enforcement of accountability reduces that risk premium. When corruption becomes a high-risk, low-reward activity, capital flows more freely and more efficiently.
And what about public trust?
Well, when public trust in the state is restored through visible accountability, citizens are far more willing to participate. Tax compliance goes up, social capital grows, they trust their money will actually be used for service, not just stolen.
So it's not just about morals. It's the engine of a modern, functioning economy. And that brings us to the external-facing benefits: political stability and national credibility.
A state that holds its leaders rigorously responsible for their actions is seen as stable and reliable, both internally and externally. Credibility on the global stage is built on reliable governance and a consistent adherence to international laws and norms.
And that's fundamentally impossible if your own local elites believe they are above your own laws.
It's impossible, and the author makes a particularly compelling point about systemic richness attracting danger.
Explain that.
When foreign powers observe a state that is perpetually struggling with internal corruption and impunity, they recognize that state is susceptible to external manipulation.
Because if a country's leaders and decision-makers can be compromised or bought with relative impunity,
that state loses its leverage. Its sovereignty is fundamentally undermined.
if that's what accountability delivers, then let's look at the dark mirror image. The inevitable consequences of accountability failure, which the source material defines just as clearly.
The outcomes are tragic and they're cyclical, and they lead inevitably to ungovernability.
Okay, what's first on that list?
First, corruption flourishes openly. It moves from the dark, clandestine corners into the daylight because the risk of consequence is near zero and the reward is astronomical.
And the institutions.
Second, institutions decay and lose competence. I mean, why should a public servant strive for competence or professional excellence if their performance is irrelevant? If only patronage, political connection, or their institutional affiliation secures their position and promotion.
So the civil service, the police, the regulatory bodies, they all hollow out.
They become shells of what they're supposed to be.
And third, and this is maybe the most devastating long-term consequence,
Citizens disengage from the state. They stop believing the system can ever work for them or deliver justice. They retreat into personal, familial, or localized networks. They ignore civic duties. And crucially, they often cede opportunities, educational, professional, and economic abroad.
that intellectual, civic, and financial exodus is a catastrophic loss of national potential.
It's the ultimate vote of no confidence.
And finally, the structural weakness attracts danger, as we touched on earlier.
Exactly. Foreign influence increases due to systemic weakness. When a state is fundamentally fractured, unable to hold its own people responsible, and its decision-makers are known to be compromised, they become liabilities to the nation's sovereignty. The external pressure points are endless.
The conclusion, then, is truly sobering, but it's vital to grasp. A state without accountability inevitably becomes ungovernable.
It's too fractured by the selective application of the law, too corrupt, and too distrusted by its own people to execute policy effectively or even maintain basic order.
So the challenge isn't just technical, it's existential. How do you pull a system back from that point of ungovernability?
Well, we have to return to the source of the ideal. Jinnah's accountability model. The book doesn't just describe the problem, it details the specific, non-negotiable pillars he envisioned for true state integrity.
And this model is rooted in the idea of constitutional supremacy and public conviction. What's the guiding principle here?
The guiding principle is visibility. Justice must be visible to survive.
Reading.
If the public cannot visibly see justice being delivered, if they only see it applied to the weak and never ever the powerful, they lose faith in the entire system, regardless of what the statutory code might say. The perception of justice is just as important as the reality of justice.
And the model had one absolute overriding command that the author emphasizes must be enforced.
It did. No individual, no office, and no institution was intended to be above the Constitution. The Constitution is the high wall against which all political, institutional, and personal power must ultimately check itself.
And that command is what necessitates the four non-negotiable pillars of his accountability model.
Yes, these are the principles that have to be enforced simultaneously to create a functional, disciplined state.
Okay, let's drive those key concepts home for our listeners. Let's start with the absolute bedrock.
Equality before law.
This is non-negotiable.
Completely non-negotiable. The system must not differentiate based on status, wealth, political affiliation, or institutional uniform. If a powerful landlord, a common laborer, and a high-ranking official commit the same act of theft or corruption, they must face the exact same legal process, the same evidence standards, and the same penalty.
The book insists that the failure to establish this equality, the decision to tolerate sacred cows, is the original sin of the unaccountable state.
It is, because when the law recognizes special classes of people, it ceases to be law. It becomes a highly destructive tool of class oppression.
That is the foundation. If you chip away at that, the whole structure just fails. The second pillar is transparent decision-making.
Right. And this takes the fight against corruption out of the courts and into the government offices themselves. It's a preventative measure.
How does that work?
Transparency is the best preventative medicine against corruption. As the source material argues, corruption thrives in the dark, in closed-door meetings, in opaque processes, in the absence of a paper or digital trail.
So all government processes.
Especially things like procurement, major appointments, land allocations, and financial disbursements must be open to scrutiny.
And what does that scrutiny entail practically?
It means mandatory public disclosure of the criteria used for decisions. It means a full justification for the final choice. And it means the entire paper trail should be published in accessible formats.
So citizens, civil society, the media, they can all monitor the process as it's happening.
Exactly. It makes the entire system hostile to illicit dealings. I mean, if an official knows their justification for awarding a contract will be publicly visible next week, the incentive to accept a bribe today is severely curtailed.
That makes perfect sense. Third, we need active and independent institutional oversight.
Right. Oversight mechanisms have to be robust, active, and fundamentally independent to effectively monitor power.
And this includes institutions like the Auditor General, the Public Accounts Committee.
And sector-specific regulators, yes. The book emphasizes they cannot be mere advisory bodies that produce reports nobody reads. They must have a genuine mandate, the resources, and the legal teeth to flag, investigate, and force correction when misconduct or financial indiscipline occurs. They're the essential early warning system against systemic decay.
And finally, the fourth pillar, which is the direct antidote to judicial delays: swift justice.
Accountability cannot be protracted. It just can't. The efficiency of the judicial system is an integral part of its integrity.
A high-profile corruption case that takes 10 or 15 years to resolve.
Is not justice. It's a prolonged political maneuver that wastes public resources and demoralizes everyone seeking redress. Swiftness restores deterrence. It ensures the punishment is closely linked to the crime, which maximizes its impact on institutional behavior and prevents the wrongdoer from enjoying the benefits of their crime indefinitely.
Okay, this moves us seamlessly into the most important practical component of this deep dive: the roadmap. The book doesn't just stop at diagnosing the disease and defining the ideal.
No, it provides a prescriptive set of 6 steps for systemic change and the restoration of the state's integrity. We're getting into the legal and judicial reforms now.
This roadmap sounds, well, radical.
It is radical because it requires a profound reversal of decades of established privileges and norms. We start with the philosophical foundation. Step 1, restore equality before law.
And the requirement here is absolute. Remove legal shields and end the sacred cow culture. This sounds great in principle, but what does removing legal shields actually entail in practice for a state dealing with powerful institutional interests?
It means undertaking a comprehensive audit of all legislation, all institutional protocols, and all historical conventions that grant effective immunity to a specific class of people, whether they are political, bureaucratic, or institutional actors.
So it's not just about amending the Constitution.
No, it's also about reviewing all the related service laws, privileges acts, and procedural codes that inadvertently create these special legal classes. The law must be made universal regardless of a person's portfolio, rank, or office.
This requires immense political will. You're challenging the very structure of the established powerful networks.
You are. And the book highlights the existential danger of failure here. The moment equality before law ends, the state begins to fracture.
Because if one significant part of the population is systematically treated as the ruler, entitled to special legal treatment, and the other is just the ruled,
the constitutional social contract is irreparably broken. You have lost the moral authority to govern.
that is the profound political transformation required. Okay, moving to step 2. Depoliticize accountability institutions. If justice is being selectively applied, the institutions themselves must be removed from political influence.
This is all about insulating the tools of justice from an executive or institutional hijack. The characteristics required for effective institutions are non-negotiable. They must be autonomous, professional, transparent, and legally protected from interference.
And their leadership can't be a simple political appointment.
No. The book suggests appointment through multi-partisan consensus mechanisms, perhaps involving the legislature and the judiciary, to ensure genuine independence from the sitting executive branch.
The core goal, as the source states, is that accountability must be solely dedicated to justice, based purely on evidence and law.
Not political maneuvering or vendetta. If the anti-corruption bodies or investigative agencies are perceived as working solely for the ruling party, they can never restore national confidence. Their mandate has to be objective, based on evidence and law, regardless of whose highly placed door the investigation leads to.
Until accountability is entirely separated from the short-term, cyclical nature of politics.
The selective application of law will continue, and impunity will remain structural.
Then we have step 3. Speed up justice. The direct confrontation with judicial delays, which we identified as a key shield for the corrupt elite. What prescriptive reforms does the book call for here?
It calls for a systemic, top-to-bottom overhaul that targets the culture of inefficiency.
Okay.
First, the establishment of fast-track accountability courts, specifically designated and highly resourced to handle high-profile corruption cases. These courts must have dedicated judges, streamlined rules of procedure, and protection from interference.
And what about the procedural abuses that lead to these endless delays?
The book calls for the implementation of strict, judicially enforceable timelines for proceedings. This is particularly important for high-profile cases. You have to set limits on the frequency and duration of adjournments. The culture of delay, where legal teams just leverage bureaucracy to stall, must be replaced by a culture of urgency and defined outcome.
And beyond the courts, the bureaucracy itself needs reform. to assist the judicial process.
Absolutely. You need major procedural reforms to cut the bureaucratic red tape in evidence gathering, in case preparation, in the submission of official documents. Government departments often stonewall or deliberately complicate investigations. This has to be criminalized, and systems put in place to mandate cooperation.
And finally, the technological solution.
The utilization of technology-driven case management systems. Using digital tools to track progress, manage massive volumes of evidence, and ensure transparency and scheduling can drastically reduce the administrative friction that currently allows cases to stall for months or years.
So digital systems can enforce the timelines the humans are supposed to be following.
Exactly. Delayed justice, as the source insists, is silent injustice. It silently legitimizes the wrongdoer and destroys deterrence.
Okay, we're moving now from court reform to prevention and cultural change, focusing on the systemic checks designed to stop corruption before it even reaches the courts. We start with step 4, strengthen oversight bodies.
This is the preventative step. If you can enforce discipline and catch misconduct early or stop a scandal before it erupts into a national crisis, the damage is minimized, and the culture of accountability is continuously reinforced. This requires a profound revitalization of key watchdogs that have been intentionally weakened over time.
Let's detail which watchdogs need this revitalization, starting with financial discipline.
First, the audit institutions. They must be financially and politically empowered and fully independent to ensure financial discipline across all government departments.
And their mandate needs to expand.
Yes. From merely auditing expenditures after the fact to enforcing compliance with financial rules during the execution of budgets, their reports have to lead to automatic enforceable sanctions, not just polite parliamentary debate that goes nowhere.
And the parliamentary role itself needs to be strengthened, right?
Oh yes, parliamentary oversight. Committees, especially the Public Accounts Committee, must stop being rubber stamps controlled by the executive. They have to start actively and aggressively holding the executive accountable, using those detailed audit reports as their primary tool for calling high-level officials to account.
Which requires institutionalizing the committee system with independent staffing and adequate resources.
It does. And beyond the legislature, you have your regulatory bodies and public guardians.
Tell us about those.
Regulatory authorities in essential sectors like energy, infrastructure, finance, telecommunications must be legally empowered to enforce sector standards with autonomy without needing political approval for every single enforcement action.
And the ombudsman offices.
They must be strengthened. These offices are designed to protect citizen interests and address maladministration quickly. If citizens have a reliable, non-judicial avenue to seek redress against poor service or bureaucratic abuse, it reinforces the state's commitment to service and reduces the pressure on the formal courts.
Step 5 is transparency and governance, and this is where the sunshine comes in. The book argues that radical transparency kills corruption before it starts. What specific mechanisms are called for?
The logic is simple. If officials know that their decisions, their contracts, and their financial flows will be visible to the public, the incentive to engage in corruption is severely reduced. The book calls for several specific, modern mechanisms that utilize digital platforms.
Such as comprehensive open data policies.
Open data means making government data not just budgets, but execution reports, performance metrics, and service delivery figures available to the public in accessible, machine-readable formats.
So you empower civil society, journalists, independent analysts.
To act as a massive decentralized watchdog force. This complements transparent procurement processes, where every single stage from the initial tender and pre-qualification criteria to the final winning bid and the executed contract is published online, including the justification for the choice.
This shifts the burden of proof, essentially. If the process is open, illicit dealings become incredibly risky.
Absolutely. And we also need public disclosure requirements for high-level officials that are meaningful. Disclosure of assets, liabilities, potential conflicts of interest. It has to be mandatory, rigorously verified by an independent body, and made publicly accessible, not hidden away in some sealed file.
And the final piece of this transparency puzzle is digital governance itself.
Yes, moving towards widespread digital governance initiatives, migrating all citizen-facing services, permitting processes, and license renewals online minimizes human interaction.
Which is often the critical point of corruption.
It is. Digital systems enforce rules consistently, automatically, and transparently, removing the official's ability to demand a bribe for performing a simple, mandated duty.
And that leads us to the final and perhaps most culturally challenging step in the roadmap. Step 6, creating an accountability culture at every level. This is about universality, making accountability not just a law, but an expected way of life within the state apparatus.
This is the critical shift from structural reform to deep behavioral and cultural reform. The book states it definitively. Accountability must be universal, or it becomes injustice.
Meaning, if only a handful of high-profile individuals are punished.
But the vast bureaucratic machinery underneath remains untouched by genuine scrutiny. The culture of impunity will simply mutate and persist elsewhere. The system has to feel pressure from the top down and from the bottom up.
So who exactly must this universal accountability culture apply to? We need to list the sectors that require this cultural discipline.
It must apply horizontally and vertically across the entire state structure without a single exception.
So politicians?
Accountability for politicians who must set the moral and legal example. For bureaucrats who are the engine of state execution and administration. For judges whose ethical conduct and judicial integrity are paramount to the entire structure.
And it continues.
For regulators who must be free of industry capture. For the police, who are the first point of contact between the law and the citizen, and often the first point where impunity is felt. And for all public servants, down to the lowest level.
So this cultural shift means that performance reviews, ethical compliance, and adherence to transparent procedure become the only routes to promotion.
They have to be. They must replace patronage and political networking. When accountability cascades through all these levels, it becomes an ingrained cultural expectation, not just a sudden political event or a short-lived campaign. It defines the character of the state.
This roadmap is incredibly comprehensive. It moves from fundamental legal structure to judicial efficiency to preventative measures and finally to cultural reform across all sectors. Let's conclude our deep dive by looking at the future vision that's outlined in the book. A governed, accountable Pakistan defined by Jinnah's principles.
The vision is that of a functional state, one that has finally delivered on the constitutional ideals laid out at its founding. It's a vision where the principles of Quaid-e-Azam are not just relics of history, but are actively enforced policy and accepted cultural norms.
The book summarizes this restored Pakistan with 4 key elements. First, public office is universally treated as a trust.
This means every single person in a position of government authority understands their fiduciary duty to the public. They understand they are temporary custodians, legally and morally bound to act for the public good, rather than viewing their role as an opportunity for personal enrichment or political gain. This reestablishes the core moral contract between the state and the citizen.
Second, and this is the practical outcome, corruption becomes a high-risk, low-reward activity.
This is the practical result of implementing all 6 steps of the roadmap. When the likelihood of getting caught is drastically increased through transparency and oversight, when the penalties are swift and severe through efficient courts, and when the legal shields are entirely removed, the rational choice for any official is to adhere to the law. Deterrence only works when impunity dies.
Third, institutions are defined by discipline and enforcement.
The institutional decay is reversed. The civil service, the police, the judiciary, they become reliable, predictable, and competent. They are once again merit-based institutions dedicated to professional excellence, capable of delivering results and maintaining order without favoritism or corruption. They function as designed, not as compromised political appendages.
And finally, law commands universal respect.
And not because of a fear of arbitrary power, but because of its equitable and universal application.
So when the most powerful figures, the elites, the most politically connected, submit visibly and consistently to the law,
the common citizen is far more willing to respect and adhere to that law. And this leads us to the book's final, powerful assertion regarding the ultimate measure of national strength and resilience. A disciplined state is an unstoppable state.
Discipline, enforced by accountability, is the ultimate source of national resilience, stability, and capability.
It's the bedrock.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into this crucial constitutional framework, based on Zaheer Ahmad Meer's work. The core insight we've extracted is undeniably clear. The nation's profound challenge is not a lack of talent, a lack of laws, or even a lack of resources.
Not at all. It is fundamentally a structural, systemic, and cultural lack of accountability.
And because of that lack,
the resources are endlessly squandered, the talent emigrates to systems that reward competence, and the laws are selectively applied to maintain elite control. The paralysis comes entirely from this culture of impunity that prevents the state from deploying its own inherent strengths for the public good.
the author delivers a final command that serves as both diagnosis and prescription. distilled down to its very essence.
It's powerful.
End impunity, enforce law, and Pakistan will govern itself with dignity. That is the roadmap. Clear, concise, and absolutely necessary.
And as we close this analysis, we leave you with one final thought to consider, building on its necessity of universal accountability.
Okay.
If the rule of law in a nation is ultimately defined not by the eloquence of its written statutes, but solely by its selective application, if the system consistently fails to prosecute the wealthy and the connected, creating these structural shields, does that state truly possess authority that commands respect?
Or does it merely wield power that demands obedience?
Exactly. How should you, the learner, evaluate a legal system based not on its statutes, but on who it consistently fails to pursue, and why that failure has become a normalized, predictable function of the state?
That's a fundamental question of legitimacy.
It is, and it's
Okay.
one worth mulling over.